The story begins not in the halls of power, but in the quiet hum of a Kentucky farmhouse. The year was 1877. The fields swayed in the wind, and a boy named Edgar Cayce sat beneath the soft flicker of an oil lamp, his Bible open upon his lap. His eyes often lingered on its words long after the light should have gone out. Neighbors would whisper that the boy had a strange gift. He could fall into a kind of sleep, a trance, and when he awoke, he would speak of things no one had told him, things that would one day happen. It sounded impossible. And yet, from that humble farmhouse, one of the most mysterious prophets of the modern world would emerge. As Cayce grew older, he discovered that when he entered this deep sleep, his consciousness seemed to drift somewhere beyond the veil. His voice would change. The soft Kentucky accent became measured, almost otherworldly, as if someone, or something, spoke through him. People would ask him questions about illness, about the lost civilizations, about the years yet to come. His answers were written down carefully by stenographers, forming thousands of pages of transcripts. And through those words, a pattern began to appear. Cayce didn't speak in riddles or poetic symbols. He spoke plainly, with dates, with names, with events that could be tested. He warned of the great economic collapse that would come to America before 1930, urging those who listened to prepare for a time of loss and renewal. Years later, newspapers would call it the Great Depression. He described the rise of conflict in Europe long before the world knew the name Hitler. He spoke of a discovery in the deserts of the Holy Land, ancient scrolls that would reveal forgotten truths about God and humanity. In 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, just as he said. Even those who mocked him began to notice that the coincidences piled too high. A man predicting stock market crashes, wars, discoveries, even his own death. It was too precise, too clean. And yet Cayce himself never sought fame. He remained gentle, soft-spoken, always claiming that his ability came not from himself, but from a universal source of consciousness, a record he called the Akashic. He once said, "There is no time, no space. All is one." For Cayce, time wasn't a river flowing forward, but an ocean, every moment existing together. He could dive into that ocean and bring back glimpses of the future. Those who came to him were not always seeking miracles. Some simply wanted to know what awaited their children. Others wanted to know the fate of their nation. And America, he said, would face trials not unlike those of the soul itself, tests of greed, of division, and of truth. But not all of his readings were comforting. During the 1930s and 1940s, in the midst of economic despair and global war, Cayce began to speak repeatedly about the new age, a coming transformation that would shake the foundations of the earth and test humanity's spirit. He said that this shift would begin in the land of his birth, the United States, and that its storms would not only be of nature, but of conscience. For the nation that forgets its creator, he warned, shall lose its direction. To the average listener of that era, these words sounded moral, even biblical. But buried among his thousands of recorded trances were certain readings, odd, almost coded, that described events far beyond his lifetime. They spoke of the rise and return of a leader, of a time when America would stand at a crossroads, torn between unity and decay. And though few noticed then, Cayce's own followers carefully preserved those transcripts, waiting for the day they might matter. It is here that the mystery deepens. For nearly a century, these forgotten pages gathered dust, overshadowed by Cayce's more famous health readings and spiritual teachings. But as new generations of researchers revisited his words, they began to see a pattern, one that seemed to align disturbingly with our present day. Cayce described a leader of the North, a man connected to the earth through the act of building, who would ascend to power during a time of national division. He would lead once, depart, and then return again, an echo of the rarest pattern in American history. He did not name this man, but his description was clear enough to raise eyebrows among those who studied both prophecy and politics. For in the decades since Cayce's death in 1945, only one American president would fit that precise mold, a man of wealth, born to the north, whose empire was built upon the ground itself. A builder, not a politician. And like the tide, his rule would come twice, once to rise, once to return. When Donald Trump took office in 2017, few could have imagined that nearly a century earlier, a sleeping prophet had already described his path. Fewer still would believe that the true test Cayce saw was yet to come. In the silence of those yellowed pages, Cayce's words rest like a dormant seed. In the years when the earth changes and men divide, a leader shall face the choice of light or darkness. His decision will shape the land for generations. No one could have known what that meant. But now, as the world edges closer to 2026, the question returns, whispering through history like a forgotten echo. Did Edgar Cayce see our future? Perhaps the answer lies not only in what he said, but in what he left unsaid, the spaces between his words, where prophecy and free will entwine. History has a way of testing prophets. For every vision that fades into myth, another re-emerges, too precise, too haunting to dismiss. Edgar Cayce's predictions were not couched in the mystical language of dreamers. They were written, recorded, catalogued, like a scientist observing a force he could not explain. Over 14,000 readings, each transcribed word for word, describe a mind suspended between two worlds, one awake, one asleep, and within those words lies a record of astonishing foresight. He foresaw the Great Depression, warning clients in the 1920s of a catastrophe of speculation that would bring the wealthy and poor alike to their knees. He described the outbreak of World War II when Europe still believed in peace. He even spoke of the pole shifts and earth changes that scientists would later recognize as tectonic and climate disturbances. Each prediction came with dates, not metaphors. He was meticulous, almost cold in detail, as if reporting from a ledger of the future. It was this precision that set him apart. While other mediums drifted in poetry, Cayce spoke like a historian yet to be born. "Watch the seas," he once said, "for they shall change their borders, and the lands will move in their sleep." Decades later, entire coastlines have indeed shifted. "Look to the east," he warned, "for there the struggle will begin anew, and nations will rise and fall for the sake of power." The echoes of those words still ring across the headlines of our own time. But it was not only war and disaster that he saw. Cayce also described the rebirth of lost wisdom, the rediscovery of knowledge buried in sand and sea. He told of a chamber beneath the Sphinx in Egypt, a hall of records that would one day reveal the origins of humankind. To him, history was cyclical. Civilizations rose, fell, and rose again as souls returned to complete unfinished journeys. America, he said, was not exempt from this law of return. The land itself carried the destiny of Atlantis, the promise and the peril of using power without wisdom. In his later readings, during the final years before his death, Cayce turned his gaze toward the nation he loved. He spoke less of global war and more of moral decay. "The future of America," he said, "will depend upon the people's attitude toward one another." He warned that when division and materialism replaced compassion, the nation would tremble from within. To his followers, those words sounded spiritual. To modern readers, they sound uncomfortably familiar. Among his lesser-known sessions are a series of readings from 1938 to 1943, unremarkable at first glance, but when revisited today, they carry a peculiar resonance. In them, Cayce describes a period of cleansing in the 21st century. He saw an age when communication would be instant, when men would speak across great distances through invisible threads of light. And he saw that during this same age, America would be tested by its own reflection. "The greatest war," he said, "shall not be between nations, but within the hearts of its people." Then came the phrase that researchers can no longer ignore. "A leader shall rise who builds as he speaks, who leaves and returns when the land is divided." Those who first transcribed his readings could not make sense of it. To them, building might have meant moral strength, not literal towers. But history, as always, has its own sense of irony. The more his predictions unfolded, the more they began to overlap with the modern world. His mention of a new kind of war fought in the mind and in the media once seemed fanciful. Now it reads like an eerily accurate portrait of the information age. His warning that oceans will warm and the poles shall melt, which sounded impossible in the 1940s, now echoes through every climate report. Even his statement that nations shall be as one marketplace, yet none shall be content, foretells the paradox of globalization, a connected world divided in spirit. But Cayce was not simply listing future events. He wove them into a single narrative, a spiritual evolution of humanity. He believed that every crisis was a form of education, a collective initiation into wisdom. The earth is not to be destroyed, he said, but purified. In that purification, America would play a central role. He called it the testing ground of ideals. This belief shaped the core of his prophecy. He viewed America as more than a nation. It was a symbol, a mirror of human consciousness itself. If America fell into chaos, it would be because humanity as a whole had reached the threshold between selfishness and compassion. The leader he foresaw was never the cause but the catalyst, the one whose presence would reveal what lay hidden in the hearts of millions. And that is what makes the connection to our era so unsettling. The language Cayce used, a builder, a return, a nation divided, no longer feels abstract. It feels like a reflection of what we have already witnessed. By the time of his death in 1945, Cayce's followers had preserved thousands of his readings, confident that one day their meaning would reveal itself. For decades, they lay dormant, overshadowed by his more popular medical prophecies. But when researchers revisited those pages in the 21st century, they noticed something strange, a convergence of dates, all pointing toward the mid-2020s. One transcript from March 1941 reads, "In the 26th year after the midpoint of the century following mine, the land of freedom will face its reckoning." Another, from 1943, warns that changes in the earth and in the minds of men shall come together in that time. Most dismissed this as symbolic. Yet, as global unrest, environmental shifts, and political upheaval align with his timeline, the words have begun to feel like a whisper from another age. If Cayce's predictions were random, the pattern would fade. But it does not. Each reading folds into the next, forming a tapestry of foresight that leads inevitably to one moment, the point he called the test of the returning one. Who was that returning one? Scholars debate endlessly. Some believe it refers to the return of a leader. Others think it symbolizes the second coming of an idea, the rebirth of America's original spirit. Cayce, as always, left the answer hidden in plain sight. "When the builder returns," he said, "let him build not with stone, but with understanding." The world, it seems, has misunderstood the metaphor. Or perhaps it hasn't. Perhaps the builder is already here, and the true construction is only beginning. Across the span of nearly a century, Edgar Cayce's cryptic phrase, "The builder shall return when the land is divided," seemed little more than poetic mystery. But history, with its peculiar sense of timing, has a way of fulfilling its own riddles. In 2016, the United States found itself more polarized than at any moment in recent memory. The economy, though strong on paper, concealed fractures of distrust, fear, and cultural conflict. And then, as if summoned from the pages of those forgotten readings, a man whose fortune was carved in concrete and glass stood at the podium of power. Donald Trump, born in the North, heir to a real estate empire, a man who literally built his name into the skyline, embodied a kind of prophecy that few could see at first. To his supporters, he was a reformer, a breaker of systems. To his critics, a disruptor of institutions. But in Cayce's lexicon, such duality was essential. He never described good or evil in isolation. He spoke of choices, of catalysts that forced humanity to reveal its inner truth. Through conflict, Cayce once said, the soul remembers what it values. The parallels grew uncanny. Cayce had spoken of a leader who would serve once, leave, and return again in the hour of testing. At the time of his trance, such an event had occurred only once in American history, with Grover Cleveland in the 19th century. No one imagined it could happen again. And yet, after Trump's departure from office in 2021, the improbable occurred, a political resurgence that carried him back toward the highest seat in the land. When he returned in 2025, he became the 47th president, fulfilling a sequence that Cayce's followers could no longer ignore. But prophecy is never simple. Cayce did not portray this returning figure as savior or destroyer. He saw him as an instrument, a mirror reflecting the collective consciousness of the people he led. In one reading he warned, "The nation shall receive the leader it has created in its own image, for he will show it what it has become." To those who study spiritual laws, this was not judgment, but revelation. The leader's rise and fall were not accidents. They were synchronizations of karma, echoes of an ancient law that binds all civilizations. And so the question that haunted Cayce's transcripts began to echo again. What happens when the builder returns? Cayce hinted that this return would coincide with great shakings of the earth and the spirit. He described storms of water and wind along the coasts, fires that would consume the west, and a trembling of the ground beneath the nation's capital. Whether metaphor or foresight, these words have taken on eerie resonance. Hurricanes grow stronger, floods more frequent, and divisions within the nation seem to mirror the fractures beneath its soil. Researchers studying Cayce's readings noticed another detail, a recurring reference to a year, 2026. In his words, it marked the reckoning of ideals, a time when the returning leader would face his trial of the heart. To Cayce, every leader was also a soul on its journey. What happened in the physical mirrored what happened within. He suggested that in 2026, the returning one would encounter a decision that would define not only his destiny, but the fate of the people who followed him. He described this moment as a crossroad of will, when one path would lead toward reconciliation and the restoration of the nation's soul, and the other toward control, fear, and decline. He never said which path the leader would choose, only that it would be visible to all. If history is the shadow of prophecy, then the shadow is lengthening. In the months since the 47th president took office again, tensions have risen not only in America, but across the world. Economic uncertainty, escalating international conflict, and the tremors of social unrest form a tableau that looks unsettlingly like Cayce's time of purification. Whether coincidence or consequence, the resemblance is undeniable. And yet, Cayce always emphasized that no prophecy was fixed. There is no fate, he said, only choice. Even the returning leader, he claimed, would be free to alter the path. But such change would require an awakening, a recognition that the builder's true work was not in towers of steel, but in the unseen architecture of the human spirit. This interpretation, though spiritual, carries political weight, for if the leader represents the collective state of the people, then his awakening would signify the awakening of the nation itself. Cayce envisioned this as a potential moment of redemption, a pivot point where America might choose humility over pride, cooperation over conflict. For when one man awakens, he said, he awakens the many. Still, others fear the opposite. Some scholars of Cayce's work interpret the Corey builder's return not as renewal but as repetition, a cycle that must be broken. They note his warning, "Those who rebuild upon the same foundation of self shall find the walls fall once more." To them, the prophecy is not about Trump alone, but about humanity's tendency to repeat its errors. The builder symbolizes civilization itself, constructing endlessly without addressing the spiritual cracks beneath its structure. In that sense, 2026 may not be a year of politics at all, but a year of reflection, a mirror held up to every nation that has built its greatness upon material strength while neglecting the soul of its people. Cayce's metaphor of the builder becomes an indictment of modern humanity. We build towers higher, machines faster, networks wider. But what of wisdom, compassion, unity? And so, the return of the builder is not merely a single man re-entering power, but a civilization returning to its test. The same test it has faced since Babylon, since Rome, since every empire that believed it could construct eternity from stone. If Cayce was right, then 2026 will mark the moment when the great architecture of modern America is tested not by enemies or disasters, but by the weight of its own design. The builder has returned. The foundations tremble. The question remains, what will he build this time? A tower to heaven or a bridge toward one another? Cayce called it the convergence, a time when the forces of earth, mind, and destiny would press against each other so tightly that something must give. In his trance sessions from the early 1940s, he saw a span of months when storms of water and flame shall visit the shores, and the hearts of men shall be weighed in the balance. Those pages, marked and forgotten for decades, name a season between June and November of a year in the mid-2020s. For generations, it meant nothing. But now, the calendar turns, and the headlines begin to rhyme with his warnings. In 2026, the world stands on edge. Oceans grow warm, coasts erode, and fire seasons stretch into every summer. Economists whisper of collapse. Nations rearm under a thin veil of diplomacy. At the center of it all, the returning leader faces not only the turmoil of a divided nation, but the echo of a prophecy he has likely never heard. Cayce described a crucible moment when a single decision would reveal the true nature of the builder and of the people who chose him. Picture it, a podium bathed in the heat of cameras, the sky low with summer haze. The crowd waits, millions of eyes and screens fixed on a man who once promised renewal. Around him, counselors argue in hushed voices. Some urge caution, plead for peace, compromise, restraint. Others demand strength, decisive action, control. The prophet Cayce's words unfold almost line for line. He shall be pulled by voices unlike his own, some to mercy, some to might. Cayce never claimed to see the outcome. He described possibility, not destiny. In his vision, two roads open before the leader, one narrow and luminous, the other wide and shadowed. The choice, he said, shall belong to him, and through him to all. This was not theology. It was a mirror held to human freedom. For Cayce, prophecy was never punishment. It was warning, invitation, and test. Outside the halls of power, the crucible burns differently. Across America, millions feel the tension without knowing its source. The economy wavers, storms strike in strange patterns, technology outpaces morality, and beneath it all, something older stirs. A collective unease, as if the spirit of the nation itself is turning in its sleep. Cayce spoke of this too. When the people awaken to their discontent not with rulers, but with themselves, then begins the rebirth. In that awakening, he saw two outcomes. In one, the country fragments into factions, each convinced of its righteousness, each deaf to compassion. In the other, unity arises not from politics, but from conscience, a vast, quiet movement of the heart. He described multitudes gathering, not in violence, but in remembrance, citizens filling the streets not with anger, but with resolve. A demonstration of will and conscience, he called it, an act of collective choosing. Some researchers now see his words as metaphor for civic renewal, others as premonition of civil unrest. Either way, the image is powerful. Millions standing between two futures, waiting for a single decision that will define the next age. Cayce's timeline spoke of 2026 as the turning of the wheel, when the old patterns would either dissolve or repeat. If the builder listens to fear, he warned, the walls will crumble. If he listens to spirit, a new foundation will be laid. It is easy to read such words and think only of politics, but Cayce's vision was broader. He tied human destiny to the pulse of the planet itself. Earth changes, he said, mirror moral changes. When greed and conflict dominate, the elements respond. He spoke of floods where compassion runs dry, of quakes where truth is buried. To him, natural and spiritual law were one. As the earth trembles, so trembles the soul of man. Now, scientists map fault lines and measure melting ice, while philosophers debate the collapse of trust and meaning. Few would think to link them, yet Cayce did, decades before either crisis had a name. The convergence he foresaw was not punishment from above, but consequence from within, a reflection of imbalance. If 2026 truly is the crucible, then it is not the leader alone who is tested, but every heart that beats beneath the same flag. Some say the test will come through catastrophe, storms, markets, war. Others believe it will arrive quietly, in a moment of choice, unseen by most, when conscience outweighs ambition. The builder will stand before the world, and in that instant, the future will tilt one way or another. Yet Cayce insisted that even prophecy bends before free will. The future is the echo of choice, he said. Change the choice, and the echo fades. Perhaps that is why his readings end not in doom, but in hope. He spoke of a new dawn beyond the purification, when America would rediscover its soul and serve as a light to those who wander. Such renewal would not come from power or wealth, but from humility, the recognition that destiny is not conquered, only honored. And so the crucible of 2026 approaches, not as fire from the sky, but as a quiet reckoning of values. It is the moment when the builder must decide what he is truly building, and when the nation must decide whether to follow him or the truth within themselves. In that choice lies everything Cayce tried to tell us. That prophecy is not a sentence, but a mirror. What we see in it depends on who we have become. When Edgar Cayce spoke of the years beyond his lifetime, he never described them as inevitable. To him, the future was like clay, soft in the hands of those willing to shape it. The end, he said once, is only the beginning of choice. And so his final vision for America was not of destruction, but of decision. A vast spiritual crossroad where both the powerful and the powerless would stand beneath the same sky, faced with the same question. What kind of world will we build next? He foresaw a time when the planet itself would begin to reflect the moral state of its people. When humanity forgets that it is one family, he warned, the earth will remind them. Floods, fires, and earthquakes were, in Cayce's cosmology, not punishments from the divine, but the outer expression of inner imbalance, the soul of the world mirroring the chaos of human hearts. By 2026, he said, this mirroring would reach its height. Yet beyond the turmoil, he glimpsed a light, a renewal of purpose that would emerge from the ashes of fear. For those who follow his readings today, that light has become a question of collective awakening. What if the prophecy of 2026 is not about a single man, but about all of us? What if the builder Cayce saw returning was not just the leader of a divided nation, but the archetype of modern humanity, the builder of cities, empires, technologies, and illusions? Humanity too has built and rebuilt, risen and fallen, leaving the same cracks unhealed. The question then is no longer, who is the builder, but what have we been building all along? As the world edges toward that fateful year, the signs Cayce spoke of seem to unfold, not just in the physical realm, but in consciousness itself. Division has become currency, fear a language, truth a matter of interpretation. Yet within this chaos, something ancient stirs, a desire to remember what was once sacred. Churches, temples, and quiet living rooms alike hum with a similar unease, that the world is changing faster than the human spirit can comprehend, and that somewhere beneath the noise, something is calling us home. Cayce believed that call was real. He spoke of a coming spiritual awakening that would rise first among the young, a generation disillusioned with hollow promises and craving authenticity. They will seek truth, not as doctrine, but as experience, he said, and through them, the nation, shall renew its heart. To those reading in the 1940s, such words sounded vague, almost utopian. But to those watching the waves of modern unrest and renewal, from protests for justice to movements for peace, from technological revolution to a yearning for simplicity, his vision feels strangely close. He described this awakening not as a sudden miracle, but as a gradual remembering. Each soul, he said, must face the choice between fear and faith, between self and service. This, he warned, would be the true reckoning of the 2020s. Not war, not politics, but the silent confrontation within each heart. When the people choose the light, he wrote, then the earth will rest. In this sense, the returning builder, whether Trump or anyone, becomes merely the reflection of a larger human story. His choices mirror ours. His rise and fall are not separate from the collective mind that created him. That was Cayce's deeper teaching. The world outside is the echo of the world within. If the leader faces a trial of conscience in 2026, so too does every citizen, every believer, every skeptic. The year is not cursed, it is consecrated. A time when cause meets consequence and potential meets purpose. Researchers who have revisited Cayce's later transcripts note one more curious line, dated 1943. It reads, "The builder who learns compassion shall open the age of light. The builder who chooses dominion shall end what was begun." No one knows whether he spoke of politics, faith, or civilization itself. But in either case, the meaning is clear. Our future depends not on power, but on the spirit with which power is used. So here we stand, in the shadow of his vision. The builder has returned, the land is divided, and the storms have begun. Yet the story is not over. Not for him, not for us. The prophecy of 2026 may yet become something else entirely, depending on the choices made between now and then. That, Cayce insisted, is the nature of prophecy. It warns, not condemns. It shows the mountain ahead, but leaves the path untaken. In his final years, weak and weary, Cayce was asked what humanity's greatest danger would be. He did not name war, or famine, or even disaster. He simply said, forgetfulness, the forgetting that we are children of the same Creator. Perhaps that is the truest interpretation of his warnings, that every age of crisis is a call to remember. As 2026 approaches, the stage is set not for judgment, but for awakening. The leader's test may come through the roar of politics, ours through the quiet of our own choices. But both paths converge on the same truth. The future remains unwritten. Every word, every act, every moment of courage adds to its script. So when the storms come, when the headlines burn with fear, and the world seems ready to break, remember Cayce's final whisper, the sentence that outlived all his predictions. The future is not written in stone, it is written in the heart of man. And perhaps, if enough hearts remember that, 2026 will not be the reckoning we fear, but the beginning of the world he dreamed.